Hello, class. I hope you're all enjoying your April vacation. This is the audio lecture for Chapter 14 on stress, lifestyle, and health. Throughout the lecture, I'll be adding in notes regarding the 4 questions that are due for this week, so please pay attention. The reason that psychologists study stress, lifestyle, and health is because oftentimes, no matter who you are, where you are, you're feeling stressed. And oftentimes other feelings might accompany that stress. It's important that if this is a non-cultural thing and we all feel it, that we understand and define stress. So this chapter aims to explore our current understanding of stress, which includes our psychological and our physiological natures of stress. So how does stress display itself physically or mentally? And also the causes and consequences of stress, as well as stress management techniques. So hopefully you'll learn a little something throughout the course of this chapter. Now, stress can be defined as any event or environmental stimulus, also known as a stressor, that we respond to because we perceive it as challenging or threatening. So stress is a term used loosely to describe a variety of unpleasant feeling states, for example, frustrated, angry, conflicted, overwhelmed, or fatigued, can cause stress. So those unpleasant feeling states of anger can cause stress. Now, there are stimulus-based definitions. Stress is a demanding or threatening event or situation, so a high-stress job. This characterizes stress as a stimulus that can cause certain reactions. But it fails to recognize that people differ in how they view and react to challenging situations, which is where the response-based definition of stress comes into play. This emphasizes the physiological responses that occur in response to demanding or threatening situations. So this characterizes stress as a response to a stressor or an environmental condition. Neither one of these two things provide a complete definition of stress. So a cognitive psychologist who might appraise stress as a cognitive thought process might describe stress as a process whereby an individual perceives and responds to events he or she appraises as overwhelming or threatening to their well-being. So this definition places importance on how we appraise, judge, perceive demanding or threatening events, also known as stressors, which then influence our reaction, which is then what leads us to get to that kind of standard definition of stress. Any event or environmental stimulus that we respond to because we perceive it as challenging or threatening. We judge it as so. We do so using primary appraisal. So this is judgment about the degree of potential harm, threat to well-being that a stressor might entail. So we do this initial appraisal or initial judgment of the potential harm or threat and how much threat it could bring to our well-being. If it's a threat, then it's a stressor that could lead to harm, loss, or negative consequences. If it's a challenge, then it's a stressor that carries the potential for gain or personal growth. So, you taking this college level course is a challenge. It is a stress and it is demanding, but it's definitely not a threat. It couldn't cause harm, loss, or negative consequences. So, graduating from college and entering the workforce can be viewed as either a threat. If you don't get a job, you have loss of financial support, or a challenge. This is an opportunity for independence and growth. Once it's gone through that primary appraisal to assess if it's a threat or a challenge, it then goes through the secondary appraisal process. This is judgment of the options available to cope with a stressor and the perceptions of how effective such options will be. So a threat is less stressful if we believe it's something that can be done about it. So we take a stressor through this primary appraisal process, and then we take it through a secondary appraisal process to determine its threat level based upon its outcomes. If it has more satisfactory outcomes, then we might be able to lower its threaten or challenge level based upon that. So you might look at a question like, how would you feel if you got a C in this class? Taking that through a primary appraisal and then secondary appraisal. What if you received $20,000 as your full-time salary? You'd take that through both primary and secondary appraisal. With secondary appraisal, you're taking into account things like your resources available to cope. You're taking into account assessment, if the strategy or behavior will be successful in managing the stressor, right? Your ability to manage that stressor, the likelihood that they can actually produce as necessary coping behaviors and strategies. Yes, there might be an available coping mechanism, but are you personally someone who can do that kind of coping? Are you someone that has the skills and abilities to cope in that way? This diagram will sort of help lay it all out for you. You take a stressor through that primary appraisal, evaluating it as a challenge or a threat. And if it's a challenge, then you can see potential gain or growth from it, and you really just sort of stop there. If it's a threat, which may lead to harm, loss, or negative consequences, then you take it through that secondary appraisal to evaluate whether it's a low threat or a high threat. So you can see that sort of flow chart that you kind of go through. And you may not recognize this, but you are going through this particular flow chart every time you experience a threat. It sort of happens in this like manner of unconscious. Is this good or bad? Might be language that you use more frequently to establish this. Now, what may come as a shock to many of you is there is such a thing as good stress. This is known as eustress. Stress that can be positive and that can motivate us to do things in our best interest. So these are stressors that are associated with positive feelings, optimal health, and performance. Okay. Distress is the bad stress. This is the stress that causes people to feel burned out, fatigued, and exhausted, and performance can decline. So as your stress level increases from low to moderate, so does performance. At the optimal level, the peak of this curve you see here, performance has reached its peak. If stress exceeds the optimal level, it will reach the distress region where it will become excessive and debilitating and performance will decline. You see this more often not in physical things. So when, running, you hear about that runner's high. But then say you continue to do it in order to feel that runner's high, but you continue to reach this kind of dangerous stress level and doing it too much, you then might sort of peak on over into distress levels. Now, the prevalence of stress. Like I said in the beginning, stress is everywhere and plays a role in all of our lives to some extent. I'm sure you're sitting here listening to this, feeling it as we speak, even though you're currently on vacation. Stress can oftentimes evoke a variety of responses, including the physiological responses. So think your heart rate, headaches, stomach pains, that's gastrointestinal problems. So you might feel sleepiness, difficulty, concentrating, things like that. So that's your cognitive prevalence of stress. So difficulty concentrating or making decisions. When you're at a high stress space, you might sort of end up being like, I can't decide or make a decision because any decision feels overwhelming or stressful. And the behavioral, you might engage in alcohol drinking, smoking, getting high, taking actions directed at eliminating the cause of the stress. Well, I'm just going to chill out here and get wasted. Things like that tend to happen when people are feeling stressed out. Nearly half of U.S. adults indicated that their stress levels have increased over the last 5 years. And this was in 2013. So from 2008 to 2013, adults in the U.S. indicated that they had increased stress. Almost half of them had increased stress. So stress is everywhere. Stress and the study of stress is what then led to health psychology and the field of health psychology. It's a subfield devoted to the understanding the importance of psychological influences on health, illness, and how people respond when you become ill. So a health psychologist's job is to investigate the connection between stress and illness. How does getting stressed then cause physical ailments or sickness? How often have you been stressed out and it's been a difficult, stressful time at school, and then boom, all of a sudden you get the flu or a cold? It also helps you to understand why people make certain life choices. Health psychology can understand the decisions that people make. Health psychologists also aim to look at the effectiveness of interventions aimed at changing unhealthy behaviors. So why do we do the behaviors that we know could cause unhealthy things? Why do people binge eat and become overweight? Why do they smoke, even though they know it's harmful for them and could cause actual death? Which groups of people are especially at risk for negative health outcomes? So this is based on psychological or behavioral factors. Are there people with a certain personality type or certain, personality characteristics that actually are more likely to get sick or could have negative health risks due to their personality types? So Austrian physicist Viktor Frankl was sent to the dreaded Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz, where he lost his pregnant wife, parents, and brother. Frankl used his experiences in developing his theories of logotherapy, after the Greek word for meaning, the ability to find meaning even in the depth of despair by recalling pleasant memories or helping a suicidal inmate helped Frankl survive the stress and horror surrounding him. So it was Viktor Frankl, in 1905 to 1997, and his very significant and historical moment in this concentration camp in Nazi Germany, in Auschwitz, that sort of made him understand that, through meaningful and impactful conversations and memories of good times, you could actually come through despair and actually survive something that physically could actually break a person. Now, gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and education all seem to influence our perception of stress. So stress among different demographic groups is also studied by health psychologists. For example, women are more likely than men to perceive stress from concerns about money, having a lot of things to do, health concerns, and trouble relaxing. In general, younger people report more daily hassles in their lives than older people. So even though people might assume because you're young you have no problems, you have every right and research backing up the fact that you have far more daily hassles than someone who's older. Those with more money and more education also report lower levels of perceived stress from daily hassles than those with lower incomes and less education. People who make more money and have more education may lead full and hectic lives. They generally perceive that they have more control over their lives and report having more fun and less stress than those who have lower educational statuses and make less money. From 2006 to 2009, this was the greatest increase in stress levels occurred among men, whites, people aged 45 to 64, college graduates, and those with full-time employment. The change was potentially due to the economic downturn that we experienced in 2008 to 2009. So something to think about. Health psychologists will study those things. What has occurred culturally that might create an entire civilization of folks to become more stressed? Is it culturally based? Is it economically based? Which particular demographic groups face more of those things? Health psychologists might study resilience, right? Under the right conditions, facing adversity can build resilience or the ability to adapt well to significant stressors. So resilience essentially conveys the ability to respond well to stress. How do we determine who becomes resilient? What factors determine someone's resilience and their ability to get through stressful situations? Some of the research that was found, and this is from 2012, this is some of the stress among the demographic groups, right? You can sort of see in the difference in sex and the levels of stress. Mean stress scores for men were lower than women from 1983 to 2009. If we look at age groups, right? So you've got different age categories. Now you can see that everyone under the age of 25 is all grouped together. So those who were in high school were grouped in the same group as those who are in college, and that may be changing now. And then race is here, as you can see. And we sort of loop Hispanics in, or Asian Pacific Islanders in as this sort of other category. We also look at educational levels when studying stress. Employment. So are you full-time employed, part-time employed, unemployed, or retired, right? And obviously that retired group is going to be really low on the stress level. And they're going to be consistently down below most of those groups. And then you've got income group, right? So that for those who fall within a specific income group, right? It's not based upon full-time, part-time employment or anything like that, but rather the actual dollar amount that you make. How does that determine where you fall? Okay. Now, this was all done in 2012. Something I want you to think about is, have things changed since 2012 when this data was published? Do you think things are a bit on the upswing for certain groups and things of that nature, especially pre-pandemic or post-pandemic at this point? You can see this here again in a much larger scale. Now, early contributors to the study of stress was Walter Cannon. Now, Cannon was introduced to you using the Cannon-Bard theory of emotions in the emotion chapter. He was the first to identify the body's physiological reactions to stress. So he first articulated and named the fight or flight response, right? Which is, he suggested, is a built-in mechanism that stabilizes physiological variables at levels optimal for survival. So he was really the first one to say that your physical body, physiologically, that parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, right? That whole peripheral nervous system is reacting to stress. And its mechanism is to keep you at optimal levels or balanced homeostasis in order to be at survival and peak performance. So fight or flight is a set of physiological reactions that occur when an individual encounters a perceived threat. So this is produced by an activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. The arousal prepares a person to either fight or flee. And it's an adaptive response. It's what we've done for centuries in order to survive. Our ability to perceive something as a threat. And you can see here, when we experience a threat stressor, so a stressor that is perceived and we appraise as threatening, our adrenal glands release epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, which causes physiological changes in the body. Your pupils will dilate, your respiration will quicken, and your bronchial tubes will dilate. Your heart rate might increase. You might begin to sweat. Your muscles may tense or tremble, depending on what you might be doing or preparing to do. Fight or flee. After Bard, we were then introduced to Selye. So Hans Selye specialized in researching stress. He worked primarily with rats, exposing them to a variety of stressors and measuring the amount of time they could subsequently swim before giving up. They were then rescued. They were never left to die. This was a humane and ethical research project. But they were put through cold water, restraint, electroshock, surgery, and having their whiskers cut off were some of Selye's stressors that greatly reduced the amount of time the rats would swim before giving up. Regardless of the nature of the stressor, Selye found that the rats responded with a consistent pattern of behavior, which then allowed him to create what he called his general adaptation syndrome. Some people like to call it GAS, general adaptation syndrome, GAS. He believed that GAS occurred in 3 stages. An alarm reaction is initiated when a stressor is first perceived and identified. So this is your body's immediate reaction upon facing a threatening situation or an emergency. Physiological reactions that provide energy to manage the situation happen during this alarm reaction stage. When the stressors are prolonged, Selye suggested that we then enter stage 2, which is stage of resistance. During this stage, we continue to experience ongoing stress, which requires us to adapt and cope as well as possible. Although resistance is not as dramatic as the briefer, more intense alarm reaction stage, it still takes a toll, okay? So it still has a toll on your body, even though you've adapted, you've readjusted to that stressor. But you remain alert. And you're prepared to respond, obviously with less intensity because your physiological reactions have diminished, but you are still in a state of being drained, essentially. So during calm periods, we have an opportunity to store nutrients and rest and repair the body. So this is happening. Under normal circumstances, we alternate between periods of calm and periods of relative arousal. But during periods of arousal, such as during the quiz, right, where you're constantly being in stress for a long period of time, we expend energy instead of storing it. In the resistance phase of the gas, we attempt to take care of both arousal and resting functions at the same time. So we're expending energy like we're in a state of arousal, but we're also trying to store it at the same time. We're trying to do both simultaneously. And neither function tends to operate smoothly under these circumstances when it's operating alone. So it can be very difficult. The length of the stage depends upon several factors, including, first, the severity of the stressor, and B, the individual stress response style. This then leads to the final stage, the stage of exhaustion. If stressors are severe and last long enough, a person might reach the exhaustion stage, where the person can no longer adapt to the stressor. They've depleted all of their physical resources, and they experience physical wear and wear that takes a toll on the body's tissues and organs that may result in illness, disease, or death. Okay. So the strength of the energy drop is to very low levels. The exhaustion stage has much in common with the criteria for major depressive disorder. So when a person is in exhaustion, they are susceptible to stress-related illnesses. And in extreme cases, exhaustion can even lead to death. So this is a good way to sort of show it to you in a physical form. Now, this is question 1. Okay, question 1 is going to ask you about a stressful situation. Essentially, it's asking you to provide an example of a stressful situation that may cause a person to become seriously ill. How would Selye's general adaptation syndrome explain this occurrence? So, how could what's an example of a stressful situation that could cause them to go through these 3 stages, alarm, reaction, resistance, and then end up in exhaustion? Okay? So you could talk about training for a marathon, right? You might have an alarm reaction stage. You may also then have a resistance stage, and then you may end up in the exhaustion phase through that training process, if not done correctly and you overdo it. You could also talk about working overnights and not being able to get sleep because you work 24/7, having too many jobs, working 24/7, how that could lead you to go into alarm reaction, resistance, and then exhaustion phase as well too. Good. This then led to health psychologists wanting to study and understand better the physiological basis of stress, right? If Selye is saying that there is actual physical representation of how stress takes a toll on the body, okay, let's understand that better. First, they studied the sympathetic nervous system, right? So if stress triggers an arousal response via the release of hormones, then obviously the sympathetic nervous system is a part of this. Second is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. Stress leads to the hypothalamus releasing corticotrophin releasing factor hormones. This is a hormone, which then leads to the pituitary gland, this is your master gland, releasing ACTH, which then leads to ACTH, this is acetylcholine, activating your adrenal glands, which then leads to your adrenal glands releasing hormones, including cortisol. Cortisol was then discovered to be the stress hormone that helps provide a boost of energy when we first encounter a stressor, preparing us for fight or flight. So when Cannon-Bard was introducing this whole fight or flight response, it was later health psychologists who discovered cortisol, this stress hormone, as the activator of the actual fight or flight response, right? This is the first energy boost that someone receives when we encounter a stressor. If you remain in continuous elevated levels of cortisol, this is known as chronic stress, okay? And can begin to weaken the immune system. In moments of stress, this process can provide energy, improve immune system functioning temporarily, and decrease pain sensitivity. However, that is temporary, okay? Some of the more possible outcomes of chronic stress is prolonged high levels of circulating cortisol. So if we have this thing, long-term exposure to cortisol can produce a number of harmful effects, including the death of neurons, meaning your actual neurotransmitters, those things firing off chemical messengers, are going to slow, right? So if you remember the tennis ball exercise that we did earlier on in the semester, someone with high levels of cortisol constantly streaking through there, that tennis ball is going to move slower and slower, or there's going to be fewer tennis balls, so to speak. Studies in humans who have a medical condition known as Cushing's disease that results in unusually high cortisol levels suggest that cortisol abnormalities might contribute to reduced hippocampus volume, memory problems, abnormal sleep patterns, and ultimately depression. Not only can high levels of cortisol damage neurons, but these same levels appear to inhibit the neurogenesis or birth of new neurons that might help to offset the damage of loss of neurons. So it can be very difficult once you're in this particular situation to assess how to get out of this sort of negative space of having more and more cortisol. Health psychologists then wanted to study stressors. So now that they understand that there is a physiological reaction to stress and what happens to the body when stressed and what hormones are involved in stress, well, now let's actually study stressors and actual things that cause stress. Chronic stressors are events that persist over an extended period of time. So think long-term unemployment. Think the loss of someone, right? This is something that is gone and they're gone forever, and you're having to deal with the chronic stress of that situation. Acute stressors, however, are brief events that sometimes continue to be experienced as overwhelming well after the event has ended. So falling and breaking a bone. Or you might use the example of getting sick and having to miss school and missing work and then being behind as an acute stressor. So it's important that we sort of break down some of these things, because in addition to that, we also have traumatic event. This is one category of stressor or traumatic event. This is a situation involving exposure to actual or threatened death or serious injury. It could be categorized as an acute stressor, but it is a little bit more elevated because of the threatened death or serious injury business. So things like exposure to military combat, threatened acute physical assault, so physical attack, sexual assault, childhood abuse, robbery, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, car accidents. Stressors of this particular type can cause people to develop PTSD. This is post-traumatic stress disorder. We will study PTSD a lot more next week when we look at abnormal behavior. But a chronic stress reaction, including intrusive and painful memories, jumpiness, and persistent negative emotional states, among other symptoms. So a traumatic event is a stressor in and of itself, but then causes a chronic stress reaction due to its traumatic nature. Some people might also call traumatic events catastrophes that all people perceive as threats also qualify as stressors. So in general, these types of events are uncontrollable, highly negative, and occur with little to no warning. And in some cases, they can be life-threatening, okay? We have for a long time recognized the stress of war on our soldiers, as evidenced by the various names we've given the pattern of symptoms that some soldiers experience when they return. Back when in World War I, it was known as shell shock, battle fatigue in World War II, and post-traumatic stress disorder following the Vietnam War and Operation Desert Storm. Rape victims report similar physical and psychological symptoms that may meet the criteria for what is referred to as rape trauma syndrome, and more evidence that unexpected events may take their toll on one's health. Traumatic events and catastrophes are often involuntary, undesirable, and unscheduled, in that we typically don't have a lot of time to prepare for them. It is relatively easy to see how they might influence our health and well-being after they've occurred. Do catastrophes or traumatic events affect health negatively? Psychologists have spent so much time studying and trying to answer that question. Because not necessarily. Some people exposed to disaster may show chronic dysfunction, yet many others show remarkable resilience, experiencing only temporary dysfunction or distress. Moreover, research has documented a potential positive effect of stressful life experiences for some people. This is referred to as post-traumatic growth or benefit finding. People report that these events have changed their lives in positive ways, such as building stronger relationships with others, emphasizing enjoyment in life, and initiating positive changes in health behaviors. In a recent study, however, researchers asked approximately 30,000 people with and without PTSD to identify the worst trauma they have ever experienced. Some big differences were noted between those with PTSD and those without. Individuals with PTSD chose military combat, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence significantly more than those without PTSD. In general, people with PTSD were more likely than those without to choose an event that they personally had experienced. This doesn't mean that a trauma has to be personal for PTSD to develop. Keep in mind that roughly 40% of those with PTSD chose a misfortune, think death, illness, or injury, happening to someone close as their most traumatic experience. Individuals without PTSD chose indirect exposure to 9/11 much more frequently than those with PTSD. This suggests that 9/11 was widely viewed as a catastrophe, but one that did not produce a lasting PTSD in most people that had witnessed it. Now, other things that can cause stress. Life changes, okay? Some fairly typical life events, such as moving to a new home, going off to college, getting your first job, getting married, can be significant stressors, even when the move is intentional. So even when you're moving to your new first apartment after college, you're intending to do this. You're getting your own first place. You're moving out of your parents' home. It can be intentional and it can be positive, but it can still cause stress. The amount of resulting change in daily life can cause stress. Your commute may change, your new bills and finances that now occur because of this new apartment. Because of this, psychologist Holmes and Rahe in the 1960s hypothesized that life events requiring significant changes are stressful, whether they are desirable or undesirable. And in doing so, created what was known as the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. This is a scale consisting of 43 life events that require varying degrees of personal readjustment. It was developed by asking almost 400 participants to provide a numerical estimate corresponding to how much readjustment they feel each event would require. So they had these 43 life events, and next to each of them, 400 different people put a number from 11 to 100, which was a life change unit, so a score representing the perceived magnitude of life change that they would involve for that. The highest ranked one amongst these 400 people was death of a spouse. That requires 100 life change units in order to work through it. And divorce was ranked second highest at 73. Okay. Research demonstrates that accumulating a high number of LCUs within a brief time period is related to a range of physical illnesses and symptoms and mental health problems. Meaning that if you look at this list of 43 things and you can check off 50 of them and add up those life LCUs and they equal a number, and that's happened, and all those things that you've checked off have occurred in a very short amount of time, like 1 calendar year, then research has shown that you could potentially be showcasing a range of physical illnesses, particular symptoms, and some mental health problems. Holmes and Rahe use this to assess the amount of stress in people's lives. Question 2 is all about the SSRI scale. I'm asking that you choose something from the SSRI scale, which you can see in your textbook, or you can even look online. You could literally just Google Holmes and Rahe SRRS scale, or SRRS. See the list of 43 life events, choose one of them, and then going back to eustress and distress, describe how that thing could bring on good stress and bad stress. Okay? How can something on this scale bring about positive changes or negative changes? Okay? We then have daily hassles. These are minor irritations and annoyances that are part of our everyday lives. So your commute. I cannot tell you the number of times I'm lying in bed being like, you have to get up. If you don't get up now, you're not going to have enough time to get ready. And if you don't use that time to get ready, then you're not going to have enough time to get to work in a timely fashion. If I could blink my eyes and teleport to work and cut out my commute, I think everything would be so much less stressful. But these daily hassles exist, and they often lead to negative and distressed mood states. They can build up and leave us feeling stressed. And the frequency of daily hassles is a better predictor of physical and psychological health that life change units. So your daily commute, whether on the road or via public transportation, can be hassles that contribute to our feelings of everyday stress. But there are other daily hassles as well, too, that could also potentially cause this significant amount of stress. Okay? Even though each individual hassle causes a low level of stress, the overall impact can quickly add up. In fact, research suggests that hassles account for the majority of stress that people feel. So whenever someone is feeling overwhelmingly stressed, it could be important to reframe it as a hassle, not a stress. But major life events and catastrophes can be hugely stressful, but they occur more infrequently. Because a catastrophe occurs so infrequently, it's the adding up of daily hassles that could cause more physical depletion in our health than a catastrophe because they're so infrequent. They don't happen all the time. Good. Now, some other additional stressors that's important to review are high-stress occupations. So if you have a difficult, demanding, or unsafe working conditions, if your occupations contain unpleasant elements, exposure to loud noise, harassment, threats of physical violence, constant frustration, this could be a stress as well too, and can cause job strain. So a work situation that combines excessive job demands and workload with very little discretion or in decision-making or job control, meaning you have a huge amount of work to do, but you don't have a ton of independence in that job because you just keep getting told what to do and told what to do and told what to do without any actual ability to prioritize what needs to be done first or control over what happens and how that goes. That can cause job strain. Job burnout, on the other hand, is a general sense of emotional exhaustion and cynicism in relation to one's job. So this occurs frequently among people in human service jobs. So think social workers, teachers, police officers. They experience tons of job burnout because there's lots of emotional exhaustion and cynicism in relation to one's job. Many people don't look fondly upon their roles, so they tend to be very cynical about their jobs, or it doesn't bring them a ton of joy to be in their jobs because of the way other people perceive and view their jobs. Other stressors, shockingly enough, could also be close relationships. Other people tend to read this and they think, I don't understand. Especially because later on in this chapter, we're going to talk about how important social support is when you're feeling stressed out. But close relationships with friends and family can actually be a source of stress, right? Oftentimes when I'm working with students or having conversations and they say, oh man, I'm just so stressed out. And I say, oh, why, what's going on? And they say, oh, well, so-and-so. And their stress is related to another person. So negative aspects that can cause stress include adverse exchanges and conflicts with others, lack of emotional support or confiding, so your inability to be supported by the people that you love when you feel like you should be able to get that from them can cause stress, or lack of reciprocity. I'm constantly there for someone, but they're not constantly there for me, and that doesn't feel like a very good reciprocal relationship, and it feels really difficult and tense, and it causes stress. So that's something else that we tend to look at. Now, let's look deeper at stress and illness. So, there is a psychophysiological disorder, okay, when it comes to stress. This is chronic stress, and its sustained physiological reactions can lead to wear and tear in the body. Okay, so how does that physically display itself? For example, that might equal sustained high blood pressure, which can lead to heart attack or heart failure. That could also mean continuous exposure to cortisol, right? We talked about continuous exposure to the stress hormone can weaken the immune system, putting a person at risk for infection or disease. This then leads to psychophysiological disorders, where you end up with an actual physiological disorder, but it's related to and directly connected to psychology and your psychopathy. So physical disorders or diseases whose symptoms are brought about or worsened by stress and emotional factors. Common example, tension headaches. If you're feeling a headache and you're thinking, oh man, I just got to get more sleep. Well, why aren't we sleeping? Are we having stress and anxiety about something? Is there emotional factors that are keeping you from being able to sleep for an amount of time? Well, here come your tension headaches as a result. Asthma. Oftentimes, asthma is not a product of the fact that, like, oh, you just had bad lungs. Asthma is actually a product of and a symptom of a panic disorder, which could be brought on, and panic disorder can oftentimes be brought on by chronic stress and emotional factors that you might be feeling. Acne, right? Stress acne is a thing. It's why you might see adults who still have pimples, and you think, oh man, I thought that stuff ended in teenage years. No. Eczema is a skin rash or skin irritation that can be brought on by stress. Hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, and coronary heart disease are other examples of psychophysiological disorders that someone might experience after high times of stress. Now, if we look specifically at the immune system and what happens when experiencing lots of stress, you have first the autoimmune diseases. So these are immune system mistakes, the body's own healthy cells for invaders, and repeatedly attacks them. If you have an autoimmune disease, this could be an error resulting in chronic stress. The second immune system error is immunosuppression. This is the decreased effectiveness of the immune system. So this is where if you have chronic stress, you end up going into a state of immunosuppression, meaning that your actual immune system, which is there to help fight diseases, can decrease, meaning you could become more susceptible to becoming sick, illness, disease from others because you don't have a good immune system. Now, if we link the two things, this is called psychoneuroimmunology. This is the field that studies how psychological factors influence the immune system and immune functioning. Studies have shown that the immune system can be classically conditioned, leading to the idea that if classical conditioning can alter immunity, then so can other psychological factors. Many kinds of stressors are associated with poor and weakened immune functioning. So if we ask ourselves this broad question of how does stress weaken the immune system, we can answer it with one way, that the immune system is weakened through the hormones released during stress. So if we look at it from a biological standpoint, hormones. The hormones that are released during stress, these hormones inhibit the production of lymphocytes. These are your white blood cells, which are important to your immune system. So if we're constantly secreting cortisol and stress hormones, that means we're inhibiting and decreasing the production of the lymphocytes, which are our white blood cells, which are important to the immune system. So that's looking at it from a strictly a biological standpoint. Cohen in 1998 looked at 267 healthy volunteers, and they were interviewed about recent stressful experiences. So after the interview, they were given nasal drops containing the cold virus. So they literally put the cold in people. And this graph here shows the percentages of participants who developed cold after receiving the cold virus, after reporting having experienced chronic stressors lasting at least 1 month, 3 months, or 6 months. So if a participant said that they had a 1 month stressor and they had no chronic stressor or a chronic stressor for 1 month, the percentage of the people who got colds were more than 3 months. So you could see the increase from 1 month to 3 months, and then at 6 months, it actually goes down a little bit. So participants who reported experiencing chronic stressors for more than 1 month were more likely to develop colds than those who reported no chronic stressors. And the same is true for each of the other categories, 1, 3, 6. But what's interesting is that for those that reported experiencing chronic stressors for more than 3 months, were more likely to get cold than those who experienced a chronic stressor for greater than 6 months. And that says something about our ability to adapt after a certain period of time. It then was important for psychologists to look at stress and aging. So research suggests that stress can shorten telomeres. These are your DNA segments that protect the end of chromosomes. Shortened telomeres can inhibit/block cell division, which includes growth and proliferation of new cells, leading to more rapid aging. So if you have more stress, you're actually going to age quicker. Okay? So what geneticists did is they went in and they measured telomere lengths. These are the actual lengths of your segments of DNA at the end of your chromosomes. And they are shorter in adults who experience more trauma as children. So people who had more trauma as children had much shorter telomeres, even as adults later on in life. It had an impact on them. We also looked at cardiovascular disorders. So these are symptoms. The cardiovascular system plays a central role in the stress response, making it a key focus in studies for physiological disorders with relation to stress. The first one is heart disease. So this is a cardiovascular disorder. A major risk factor for heart disease is hypertension. And hypertension is high blood pressure. So this can be caused by stressors including job strain, marital conflicts, and natural disasters. It's why every time you go for a physical, they take your blood pressure. And if it falls within a certain range, they instantly start to ask you questions about your life and what you might be doing at that time. They might start asking you about the work that you do, your occupation, right? It's why when you have a physical and you're older, they're going to ask you what your occupation is when you go there. So hypertension forces your heart to pump harder, thus putting increased physical strain on the heart. But there are no symptoms. It can lead to a heart attack, stroke, or heart failure, as well as kidney failure and blindness. But it literally doesn't have any other symptoms other than, oh, you've had a heart attack. You must have, now we know that you have hypertension or high blood pressure. Both heart disease and hypertension have also been linked to negative affectivity. This is your tendency to experience distressed emotional states, so anger, contempt, disgust, guilt, fear, and nervousness. So if you have increased heart disease and hypertension, you also potentially have increased negative affectivity. And if you have increased negative affectivity, that could also sort of give you this sort of loop of, okay, well, now I'm just going to be constantly stressed out because I'm also constantly negative and feeling bad. Okay. You go through here the heart attack symptoms for males and females. They are different based upon your gender, and they believed that it's important for you to know that. Now, Friedman and Rosenman thought it would be good to study personality types. Okay, so they discovered that people who are prone to heart disease tend to think, feel, and act differently than those who are not. So if cardiovascular disease is such a strong physical disease that is chronically linked to stress or is linked to stress and is a psychophysiological disorder, then it's important to study, okay, if heart disease is one of the main leading causes of death in this country, do those people tend to have similar personality? Do they tend to think, feel, and act similarly so that we can maybe say, okay, if you think, feel, and act a certain way, then you might be more likely prone to this particular disease. And they found that heart disease is over 7 times more frequent among people who they categorized as what was known as a type A. So it's funny when people tend to use type A and B personalities to describe themselves. Well, I'm very type A, right? I am very competitive. I'm very driven. I need to get things done in a certain amount of time. And they have this image of what it means to be a type A personality. And you have to actually look at what Friedman and Rosenman did in 1974 because it's not what people think of it today. They believe that type A personality tended to be extremely competitive, intensely driven, but they also are impatient, they are rushed, and they are hostile towards others, right? So they are not like sunshiny people. They are, I want something and I want it now and I need it instantly and I need to get my way. Whereas a type B personality tends to be a little bit more relaxed and laid back. So further research suggested that one of the most important factors in the development of heart disease is the anger hostility dimension of the type A behavior pattern. Again, so we're going back to the negative affectivity. Individuals that indicated that they responded to pressure and anger were over 6 times more likely than those who indicated less anger to have a heart attack by the age of 55. So if anger is the first thing that you go to, then you're 6 times more likely to have a heart attack by the age of 55. Your question 3 is all about type A behavior pattern. So you need to essentially discuss the concept of type A behavior pattern, its history, and what we now know concerning its role in heart disease. Okay, so why are those two things linked? Good. This then leads us to the transactional model of hostility for predicting social interactions. So anger and hostility appear to constitute long-term risk factors for adverse cardiovascular outcomes. Why? According to the transactional model of hostility for predicting social interactions, via Vella, the thoughts and feelings of a hostile person promote antagonistic behavior towards others, which in turn reinforces complementary reactions from others, thereby intensifying one's hostile disposition and intensifying the cyclical nature of this relationship. So, you can see from this diagram, you have a hostile person's thoughts and feelings, anger, mistrust, devalues others. They then put that hostile person's behavior, hostile, confrontational, defensive, and aggressiveness. So they have these thoughts and feelings of anger, mistrust, and devaluing others. They then behave towards someone else using hostility, confrontation, defensiveness, and aggression. That recipient's response is surprise, avoidance, and defensiveness, because how dare you, essentially, which then creates a reinforcing of their hostile behavior. Oh my God, see, I told you. That person is totally avoiding me because they don't know how to do their job. When really, in all reality, they're actually avoiding you because you might be a terrible human. Now, depression in the heart was also studied by health psychologists. Research suggests that a relationship exists between depression and heart disease. So one reason for this seems to be that people diagnosed with depression as children have been found to be more likely to be obese, smoke, and physically inactive. Depression may increase the likelihood of living an unhealthy lifestyle and therefore the chance of heart disease. So, the health psychologists don't just look at stress, right, and its effect on the heart and, the physical, the psychophysical, physiological disorders of stress, but they also look at all psychophysiological disorders, which includes depression and how depression can actually be linked to heart disease later on in life if diagnosed at an early age. So we discussed asthma before. So you can see here, asthma is a chronic disease in which the airways become inflamed and narrowed, leading to difficulty breathing. The psychological factors play an important role in asthma. Studies show that some people with asthma will experience asthma-like symptoms if they expect to experience symptoms. So if they think, oh man, I'm not going to be able to breathe, they then can't breathe, right? So they almost tuck themselves into asthma attacks, so to speak. People with asthma report and display a high level of negative emotions, lots of anxiety. It tends to be. Asthma attacks have been linked to periods of high emotionality, right? So they tend to have an asthma attack when they're feeling very strong emotions at very high levels. Exposure to stressful experiences have been linked to the development of asthma throughout the lifespan. So you could end up getting asthma much later on in adulthood because you experience a traumatic or stressful situation. And this is just a physical diagram of asthma, so you can see what the bronchioles look like. Now, coping styles. So how do we cope with these things, right? So this is sort of, looking at Selye's resilience stage, or looking at how we assess threats as high or low based upon our coping style. So Lazarus, who you also learned about in the emotion chapter, and Folkman in 1984 looked at problem-focused coping. So this is where an individual attempts to manage or alter the problem that is causing the experience of stress. So this involves in identifying the problem, considering possible solutions, weighing the costs and benefits of these solutions, and then selecting an alternative. So this proactively addresses the problem. It's more likely to be used when the stressor is perceived as controllable. Can we change the stress itself, the actual stressor? Can we change that stressor? Can we make a change to that stressor and still get some benefit from it if we were to change it? Whereas the opposite is the emotion-focused coping. So instead of changing the stressor, The efforts are then to change or reduce the negative emotions associated with the stressor. So this can include avoiding, minimizing, distancing oneself from the problem, or positive comparisons with other, or seeking something positive in a negative event. So this treats the symptoms of the stress, not the cause of the stress. So more often used for stressors we feel powerless to change. I can't change how my professor runs this class, but I can change how I react to how they're running this class, how I respond to the professor. Okay? So if you're stressed because you're failing a class, a problem-focused approach would be, I'm going to study more, I'm going to contact the professor for help, I'm going to find a tutor. Emotion-focused approach would be to watch a movie or play a game to distract yourself from the problem, which oftentimes isn't great, right? You're kind of in a state of procrastination in that case. Now, control and stress is important to also review because oftentimes our ability to cope with a stressor can also lead to the ability of control. So if we have the ability to enact control in our lives is a basic tenet of human behavior, right? Our ability to control our surroundings and our life is a basic tenet of human behavior. Our reaction to potential stressor depends largely on how much control we feel we have. So, perceived control is our beliefs that our personal capacity to exert influence over and shape outcomes. So if we have a high perceived amount of control, this has major implications for health and happiness. So the greater personal control, the better physical and mental health, the greater psychological well-being, and the lower reactivity to stressors in daily life. If we have high perceived control. If we believe we have no control or little control, then things are going to go a little bit haywire. This then led to Martin Seligman in 1967 wanting to understand this thing called learned helplessness. If we feel like we have a very low perceived sense of control, then this could become what's known as learned helplessness, an acquired belief that one is powerless to do anything about a situation. In his experiment, he took dogs and placed them in a changer where they received electric shocks from which they could not escape. I promise you, no dogs were harmed. When they were later given the opportunity to escape the shocks, most seemed to give up and didn't even try. So they had acquired learned helplessness. They had learned to just be helpless because they didn't think that they could control the situation or the outcome. Seligman believed learned helplessness to be a possible cause of depression. So when someone experiences depression because maybe they have a very low perceived sense of control over a situation or any stressful events, then depression could then cause a sense of learned helplessness. One thing that health psychologists realized very quickly was that social support. This is a fundamental human motive and is the need to form and maintain strong, stable relationships. Social support is the soothing impact of friends, family, and acquaintances, and it can include advice, guidance, encouragement, acceptance, emotional comfort, and tangible assistance. This provides comfort when faced with life stressors. And a psychosocial factor of affecting health outcomes. Individuals with stronger social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with weaker social relationships. Research has suggested that social support boosts the immune system and reduces blood pressure. But it could be because social support seems to be so clearly linked to positive health outcomes, why sometimes our relationships are stressors. If they weren't so important, they wouldn't mean that much. Other stress reduction techniques that are important to recognize are things like exercise. This reduces stress and increases resistance to adverse effects of stress. Exercise is also understood to release particular hormones that could be helpful to us. B, meditation and relaxation. So relaxation response techniques. This reduces sympathetic arousal and reduces blood pressure. And then biofeedback. This uses electronic equipment to measure a person's voluntary neuromuscular and autonomic activity and provide feedback to help the person gain a level of voluntary control over these processes. How do you control some of your neuromuscular things that could actually be causing additional stress? Through health psychology, psychologists began to study happiness, positive psychology, and what was known as flow. Health psychologists found 3 elements of happiness: pleasant life, which meant enjoying daily pleasures; meaningful life, meaning you contributed to the greater good; and a good life, meaning using skills for enrichment. So they defined happiness as an enduring state of subjective well-being consisting of joy, contentment, and other positive emotions, plus the sense that one's life has meaning and value. And health psychologists wanted to study how happy are people in general. Is it a collective happiness across the globe, or is it selective to particular cultural areas? They found that the average person in the world tends to be, relatively happy. So surveys of residents in over 150 countries indicated that Denmark has the happiest citizens in the world. And of those 150 countries, Americans ranked the United States as the 17th happiest country in which to live. In order to study happiness, it's important to understand the factors that connect to happiness. What factors can influence happiness? So age. Life satisfaction usually increases with age, right? You might not be able to have a sense of a meaningful and impactful life, meaning you don't have a sense that your life has meaning until you get to a certain age, because you can sort of, contribute to the greater good. For example, you might not be able to start doing that until you reach a certain age. Family and social relationships can also influence happiness. Married people report being happier than those that are not. High quality social relationships and strong social support networks correlate to increased happiness. Money, so socioeconomic status. A nation's gross domestic product, also known as GDP, is associated with happiness levels, meaning wealthier individuals tend to be happier than poor individuals. And happiness increases with income only up to 75%. So yes, you will feel better once you reach a certain income, but once you get further than that, you kind of plateau. Then you've got religion. In nations with difficult living conditions, religiosity is associated with greater well-being, but does not make a difference in nations with favorable living conditions. So you might find in third world countries, there is still a really strong sense and greater well-being because they all surround themselves with a strong sense of faith in a deity, right? Whereas in nations with favorable living conditions, religion doesn't have a ton of factor into our well-being because it doesn't need to. We have enough good, infrastructure to help us give us our well-being without needing to rely on our faith. And culture. People that possess characteristics, values in their culture tend to be happier. So those that have a strong sense of culture around a particular ethnic group might have greater happiness than those that don't have a strong sense of culture or cultural background. Now, life events. So if life events can also be stress, how can life events also contribute to our happiness? People are often poor at predicting the intensity and duration of their future emotions. Events might initially cause an intense surge of emotion, but we eventually adapt to the changing emotional circumstances in our lives. Dramatic life events have much less long-lasting impact on happiness than might be expected. So, in picture A, long-suffering Chicago Cub fans would no doubt feel elated if their team won a World Series championship. And B, in ways that are similar, those who play the lottery rightfully thinking that choosing the correct numbers and winning millions would lead to a surge in happiness. However, the initial burst of elation following such elusive events would most likely erode in time and have actually found to cause more stress once given that significant amount of money. And we can look at this sort of graph here to show us exactly what could potentially contribute. This graph shows life satisfaction scores several years before and after 3 significant life events. Okay. They used marriage, death of a spouse, and unemployment specifically. This then led to Martin Seligman in 1998 creating the field of positive psychology. So if happiness is something that we want to study, then we want to study positive psychology. We offer a course here on positive psychology. It urged psychologists to focus more on understanding how to build human strength and psychological well-being. If stress can create so many of these psychophysiological disorders or even other things that could need to create coping mechanisms and resilience, then why not study positive psychology, things that could build human strength and psychological well-being? Positive psychology seeks to identify and promote these qualities that lead to greater fulfillment in our lives. So they study things like well-being, satisfaction, hope, and optimism. They study things like happiness, capacity for love, courage, interpersonal skills, aesthetic sensibility, perseverance, forgiveness and compassion, originality, future-mindedness, and spirituality. They also started to look at positive affect and optimism. So if we're going to study negative affect, then why not study positive affect? This is the pleasurable engagement with the environment, such as happiness, joy, enthusiasm, alertness, and excitement. So if negative affect can be associated with negative things, then let's study greater social connectedness, emotional and practical support, adaptive coping efforts, lower depression, longevity, and favorable physiological functioning. Which then offers us an ability to look at optimism. This is the general tendency to look in the bright side of things. Okay, this is a tendency to expect good things will happen. If someone exhibits optimism, are they more likely to have a positive affect and then also then to exhibit less stressors in their life, or at least have better coping mechanisms when faced with traumatic life events, catastrophes, and things we know that could have a serious physical and psychological impact on our daily lives? This then led to them looking at this state of flow. Flow is a particular experience that is so engaging and engrossing that it becomes worth doing for its own sake. So this is when you lose yourself in an activity. You have effortless concentration and focus on that one thing, and it feels like time passes more quickly than usual, right? Often people will say things like a good job is one that you can do for days on end without any distraction or breaking. Oftentimes, though, flow is related to creative endeavors and leisure activities, right? So oftentimes, flow states are a little bit different, experienced by people who like their job or students who love to study. It typically occurs when people engage in challenging activities that require skills and knowledge that they know they possess. But flow is thought to play a very key role in happiness. Great. Okay. Question 4 is a little bit different, so I'm sure I covered all of the first 3. The last one is social support. So remember that whole slide on social support. Describe how social support can affect health both directly and indirectly. Okay. Good. You've got your 4 questions. Please make sure you answer them thoroughly. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me at nwestnwest@westfield.ma.edu.